All right, Mark Rogers TV rating all the conferences. We've explained the formula. Please go back to that video and check out our method to the madness and how we are rating the conferences. It's based purely on the Power 5 results and non-conference in 2017. Let's start with the Pac-12, which just the eyeball test, the results, the horrible play and results in postseason would tell me that this is the worst conference in the country, at least in 2017. Let's see what the numbers have to say. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you. Hopefully I explain this well. The Pac-12 went 9-10 against the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Big 12. Those 9 games that the Pac-12 won, those 9 teams in the Pac-12 went 67-50 overall. That was their record in all their games, 67-50. They won 57% of their games. What's interesting to note is that those 9 teams that won those 9 straight games against the other 4 leagues, they won less than 50% of their games in conference, 41-42. That 7.86 is the seed average of those teams that won the 9 games. I averaged all the seeds to say how high of a seeding did those Pac-12 teams have in their own league to go out there and win 9 games against the other leagues. All right, they beat some pretty bad teams, as you might expect. The teams that they beat in those 9 games were 52-61. They were 24-36 in their own league, so they only won 40% of their conference games, and they had a slightly lower seed than the Pac-12 team. So this is about what you would expect out of the wins. So consider what these wins were. Stanford beat Notre Dame. Really good game, really good win for the Pac-12. Washington beat Rutgers. Not a big deal. Oregon beat Nebraska. Pretty like-seeded teams there. Cal had 2 wins for the Pac-12, and they were fairly significant considering Cal's seed in the Pac-12 was a 12.84. And if that makes absolutely no sense to you, how a seed could be 12.84 out of a 12-team league, you got to watch the introductory video. We based it on a 14-team league because we had to equalize all the leagues across the board to 14 teams because of the ACC, the SEC, and the Big Ten. All right, Cal beat Ole Miss in North Carolina. USC beat Texas, so USC's the 1 seed in the Pac-12. They beat a 5 seed in Texas, so that's a decent win, but it's expected. Again, UCLA over Texas A&M. So there were 2 games in which a Pac-12 team as a lower seed beat a higher seed in another conference, and that gives you more points because you beat a team that is supposed to be better than you, that played really well, or better than you did, at least, in your conference. And that was the UCLA win on opening night, opening weekend, the Josh Rosen comeback over Texas A&M at the Rose Bowl, where UCLA is a 9.3 seed, defeated Texas A&M, a 7 seed in the SEC. And the other one of those would be Utah in the bowl game over West Virginia. And we know the Mountaineers were beaten up, but we can't factor that into the numbers. Strictly, Utah as a 10.5 seed in the Pac-12 beat the 7 seed out of the Big 12 in West Virginia. All right, here's the losses. And this is rarely seen. This shows you the weakness of the Pac-12 in 2017. The teams that lost those 10 games in the Pac-12 were 78-54. They won 59% of their games. They were actually better out of conference, or in the conference. They actually had a better record in the conference. So you don't really see this typically from Power 5 schools because they usually boost their overall record based on wins out of the conference against the Group of 5 and the FCS that are overwhelming toward the Power 5. The Power 5 wins 85-90% of the games against the Group of 5 and the FCS. But in this case, look at the Pac-12. These teams, these 10 teams that lost these games against the other 4 conferences, they actually played better in their own conference than they did outside of the conference. And you know what plays into this more than anything is that awful Pac-12 record in bowl play. That's what's feeding that. Consider that they lost, 7 of 8 postseason games. And so that's what factors into this. Really good Pac-12 teams are really good within their conference. USC, Stanford, Arizona State. They lost their bowl games. So that's what factors into that. They were an average 5.6 seed. They lost to an average 5.7 seed, which seems comparable. Those are comparable games. but they lost 10 consecutive in these. They should go like 5-5 in those games. They're playing a 5.6 seed out of the Pac-12, playing an average seed that's a comparable seed in the other conferences, and they lost all those games. They lost to teams that won 61% in their league. So they played really good teams that won 61% in their respective leagues, but they lost all 10 of those games. So quality wins, quality of loss based on a 14-point scale, and I explained this in the previous video, that the baseline for all the games is 14 points. If you win, you get 14 points. If you lose, you get 14 points, and I base that on the number of teams in the seedings. Unless you beat a higher seed or lose to a lower seed, then that takes away or adds to the point total. It becomes a more impressive win or an understandable loss. And you've got to watch the previous video to understand that. But believe me, so for example, this UCLA win over Texas A&M. So UCLA in the Pac-12 get 14 points, and the SEC and Texas A&M deducted 14 points. But add on to that UCLA being a 9+ seed against Texas A&M, a 7 seed in the SEC, I accounted for that as well and added 2+ points to the Pac-12 and deducted another 2+ points from the SEC, and I won't go into all the decimal points. So think about the losses for the Pac-12 here. Stanford lost to TCU in the bowl game. That's a like-seeded game, basically a 2 versus a 2. Washington lost to Penn State, another like-seeded game. Another bad loss for, not a bad loss, but another loss in which that's an even matchup for the Pac-12. Washington State lost to Michigan State in resounding fashion, and that was a like-seeded game. Even Oregon State losing to Minnesota, we think, okay, Golden Gophers, they're a better team than the Beavers. That's not a horrible loss for the Pac-12, but Oregon State with the 14 seed in the Pac-12, they were the last seed. Minnesota was the next to last seed in the Big Ten, and they trounced Oregon State, so that's not a good showing for the Pac-12. Of course, USC lost its 2 big non-conference matchups against Notre Dame and Ohio State. The really bad loss in terms of the point system for the Pac-12 was Arizona State at 6-3 in the Pac-12 was a 5.85 seed in the Pac-12, basically a 5-6 seed in the Pac-12, losing to, based on the adjusted seeding system, an 11 seed in the Big 12 in Texas Tech. That's a bad loss for the Pac-12. The other losses, Arizona State lost to North Carolina State in the bowl game. Arizona-Purdue, perfect example here for the system. Purdue, the 7 seed in the Big 10, and Arizona, the adjusted 7 seed in the Pac-12, so that's an even matchup. Purdue won the game, so the Big 10 gets +14. Pac-12 lost it, so they get -14. Kansas State beat UCLA, so the Bruins lose that one, and that's a generally comparable seeding. So the Pac-12, ironically, went 2-0 against the SEC. That was UCLA over Texas A&M, and that was the Cal win over Ole Miss. 2-0 against the SEC, 1-1 against the ACC, 2-3 against the Big 12, 2-5 against the Big 10. Of course, they had these 3 big bowl matchups against Ohio State, Michigan State, and Penn State, and lost all 3 of those games. And against the independents, the Pac-12 went 2-1. Possibly the best win for the conference out of conference during 2017 was Stanford over Notre Dame when it comes to beating a quality opponent. Otherwise, Texas A&M would be the 2 best teams that the Pac-12 defeated. All right, it doesn't go into these numbers, but just wanted to give you some reference points. The Pac-12 went 30-16 out of conference total, 30-16. As we mentioned here, 9-10 against the other Power 5 leagues. They only went 11-5 against the Group of 5, and you think maybe off the top, 11-5 is a good record, but considering a Power 5 against Group of 5 teams going 11-5, not good. And against the FCS, as you would expect, the Pac-12 dominated at 10-1. Notable games outside of the Power 5 structure, San Diego State really put a hurting on the Pac-12, defeating Stanford And they also defeated Arizona State. Two of the best teams in the Pac-12 went down to San Diego State out of the group of 5. You had Washington beat Fresno State, a decent team. Washington State beat Boise State. Boise State turned around in the Las Vegas Bowl and defeated Oregon. Oregon had a win over Wyoming. I won't go down through the entire list, but Houston defeated Arizona. Memphis defeated UCLA, so not a good showing for the Pac-12 overall. But these numbers speak strictly to the Power 5 games and the Pac-12 standings. So I took the quality of all the wins put together against the quality of all the losses put together and did the subtraction, and the Pac-12 comes out to a negative 8.01. What does that number mean? Not much of anything right now. We've got to compare it against the other 4 conferences, and we'll do that very soon right here on Mark Rogers TV.